My name's Caleb Reichhardt, and I am the Assistant Professor of Livestock Production here at UH Manoa. So today I'm going to be talking just briefly on kind of like understanding our definitions related to carcass quality and then how they impact our sheep producers, and then briefly discussing cobalt and how that relates to carcass quality because that was one of the minerals that Shay found was deficient in her study. So like I said, if you have any questions, please just let me know. So just kind of start off, I wanted to discuss kind of like our live weight, our carcass weight, and our dressing percentages and what they are and how they impact us as producers. So live weight, pretty straightforward. It's the weight of our animals when we harvest them. So it's that weight when that animal is still alive. That carcass weight, though, is going to be that weight typically taken right after harvest. So that's going to be our carcass weight. So after we've removed that hide and things like that. So that's our hot carcass weight. But our dressing percentage, what this is it's essentially the proportion of that animal's lamb weight versus essentially the carcass weight. So it's essentially how much of that live weight will be carcass weight. So how much meat are you getting out of this animal? Okay. And so how we calculate that is we just take that carcass weight and we divide that by the live weight and multiply it by 100. Okay. So if we have a 30-pound carcass and a 65-pound live weight, that means we're using about 46% of that animal. Okay. But how does this impact you as a producer? Okay. So most of our sheep here, we're actually going to be selling based off of live weight. Okay. So most of our sheep are going to be sold based off live weight. We don't sell based off carcass weight. So what that means for you is your buyers are buying a live animal and they'll typically process it themselves, or they might send it to a processing facility here. If they are buying a 100-pound lamb and they're only getting 50 pounds, they might be wondering what is going on. Where's the rest of my lamb? I bought 100 pounds. Why do I have 50 pounds of meat? That's our dressing percentage. Okay, so that is essentially, you can tell them, oh, for sheep, our dressing percentage is going to be about 54% on average. So if you're buying a 100-pound lamb, you can expect to get about 54 pounds of meat off of this animal. Okay, so it's essentially a way you can let them know, yes, they're buying a live animal, but then you can tell them exactly kind of a ballpark of how much meat they can expect to get from this animal. It's a way of essentially just making sure we're keeping our customers happy and they're not shocked when they get there. So it's really important for you to understand that when you go to sell your animals, to make sure your customers know what they're getting. But we can impact our dressing percentage, okay? So ideally, we want a higher dressing percentage, okay? So some things that impact our dressing percentages of our animals, pretty straightforward. Pelt. So we take that hide off. So if they have a heavier hide, okay, they're going to have a lower dressing percentage. Of course, we know our muscle and fat. Fat's pretty interesting in that we need fat, but we also don't want too much fat. If we have too much fat on these animals, it's going to be a waste product that we cut off. Okay. And so if you have a really fatty animal, it's going to have a lower dressing percentage. Okay. And of course, our rumen fill. Okay. So these are our main things. So essentially, how much feed and water is in that animal. Okay. So if you stuck a hose, filled that animal up with water, then weighed it, it's going to weigh a lot. Okay. And then if you harvest it, that water isn't going to be part of that meat product. Okay. So it's just things like that will impact dressing percentage. If you have a really muddy animal, that mud will impact that dressing percentage. Okay, so we want a high dressing percentage because it means we essentially get more product from these animals when we harvest them. Okay. So that is one tool we can use, is we can weigh our animals and we can kind of estimate how much they're getting. Okay. This is going to be geared towards sheep, and I'll talk about that because the next thing I want to discuss is quality grade. So if you buy beef at a store, you know, like the USDA Prime, the USDA Choice, and things like that, we also have that for lamb. So we have USDA quality grades for sheep in the US. Okay. And all a quality grade is that estimation of that palatability characteristics of the carcass. Okay. So essentially, how does it taste when you eat it? So what's the tenderness? Can you bite through that? What's the juiciness and what's the flavor? Okay, and that's all the quality grade is. So in the US, we have them for beef, and then we also have them for sheep. Okay, so for sheep, okay, our lamb carcasses in the US have those four main quality grades, which are prime, choice, good, and utility. So our beef cattle are prime, choice, select, and standard. For lambs, are prime, choice, good, and utility. Okay, so these tell us essentially the palatability, or what is the quality of that carcass. Okay, and the reason I'm focusing on sheep instead of goats is currently in the US, goats do not have USDA quality grades. So we just currently apply quality grades to sheep in the US. And so our lamb quality grades are really based on three things, and that's maturity, flank streaking, and conformation. Okay. So what maturity is essentially it's going to be the presence of a break joint on at least one front shank. So right here, if you can see my mouse, this is where we have that break joint, okay? And this is going to be in most sheep less than 14 months of age, okay? And the reason why we're looking at maturity in these carcasses is a young lamb or an old ewe, which one's going to be more tender? Okay, so if we go back to essentially our palatability characteristics, tenderness is one of our palatability. So like our taste, how hard is it to bite through essentially that meat? And we know that our younger lambs are going to be more tender. Okay, so they're going to have a higher palatability. And so when we look at the front shank on these lambs, okay, it can help us age those animals and be an indicator of tenderness, okay? So our mutton carcasses, so those are yearlings and older animals, they don't have this break joint on them, but they do have essentially a spool joint. So that's just a tool that we can use to age our animals at harvest, okay, to essentially determine how old they are. The other thing that we're going to take a look at is we are going to look at flank fat streaking in our lambs. And so what this is it's the amount of fat on the surface of the flank muscle, okay? And so when you buy, say, a beef steak, okay, you buy that prime and it has a lot of marbling in it. We can determine those prime scores a little easier in a cattle because we rib them. We don't typically rib our lamb carcasses, and so we use the amount of fat on the surface of that flank steak to estimate marbling. Okay, so marbling is really important. So it's just that intermuscular fat in our carcasses. Okay, and that's really going to be important for palatability. Okay, so essentially the flavor of that meat, the tenderness, the juiciness. Okay, if we don't have any marbling, it's going to be a really tough steak. So we do, or a tough lamb chop. So we want to make sure that we have good marbling. And so how we do that is through evaluating flank fat streaking, okay? And it's just about the amount of fat being streaked on that flank, okay? And so it can go from abundant to practically devoid is how that's going to be classified. Yeah. And then the third thing that we look at to determine our quality grade of our lamb carcasses is conformation. And all conformation is an estimate of the amount of muscling, okay? So it's primarily determined by the leg score, and it's going to be expressed numerically. So a score of 15 is the heaviest muscled, and it'll be classified as a prime plus. And essentially, it's going to be the evaluation of the muscle expression, shape, and fullness of the leg relative to the rest of the carcass. So we'll take a look at that carcass leg, and we'll essentially see how muscular it is, okay, compared to the rest of the carcass. And so we take all of this into account to determine our quality grade so you can get that USDA prime, USDA choice, USDA good stamp, okay? And what we do then, okay, so this is the USDA's sheep quality grade chart. And so this is just the relationship between flank fat streaking, maturity, and quality maturity, okay? So we have young lamb, old lamb, yearling, mutton, and mutton. Okay, and then of course our older animals. So our older animals, okay, if you look at this chart, can't ever go USDA prime. They can go choice, but they can't go USDA prime. That is because essentially they're going to be older. We're going to see that decrease in tenderness, okay? And so that's why they will age those animals, okay? So we take the degrees of flank fat streaking and then the age of the animal as well as that muscle structure. And that's going to tell us essentially if it's a USDA prime, choice, good, or utility. About 90% of lamb harvested in US is going to hit the USDA prime and the USDA choice. So we do pretty good hitting a high quality with the sheep we raise here. So it's pretty good. So we have generally a nice amount of marbling, and we harvest our lambs at a good age that we hit the choice and prime. The other thing we do is we look at yield grade. So, like I said earlier, most producers are selling their sheep based off that live weight, then that consumer will take home and they'll process themselves. But some producers do sell carcass, and that will be quality grade and yield grade. Okay, so our yield grade, okay, is just the estimate of the carcass that is expected to yield closely trimmed real tail cuts. Really, all that's saying is how much of this carcass can we actually use? Okay, so we talked about our dressing percentage where we remove the hide. Okay, but we're also need to take into account the external fat of the carcass and things like that. So when we calculate our yield grade, that's going to really be based on the external fat of the carcasses. And our US sheep yield range from 1 to 5. So a yield grade 1 of 1 is the highest expected yield. What that means, okay, is it's essentially you are getting more product in a yield grade 1 than any of the other yield grades in our sheep. So if we take a yield grade 5, that means they have a really low expected yield grade. It means they're not going to have a lot of retail product, okay? And so that's really important. Essentially, it's that usable product that our producers are getting. And so if you're selling on the carcass, they're going to take into account your yield grade and your quality grade, and that's going to determine the price that you're paid. You're going to get a higher price for a yield grade 1, and you'll get a higher price for a quality grade prime. So those will come into account. But quality grade and yield grade are going to be a little inversely related. Again, quality grade takes into account fat. Yield grade takes into account fat, but the quality grade, you'll get a higher score for more marbling. Yield grade, you'll get a lower score for more fat. And so how we take our yield grade is it's just 0.4 plus 10 times the fat thickness. So if you have a lamb with 0.2 of an inch of fat thickness, it'd have a yield grade score of 2.4. So I'd put it right in that middle of those yield grades. Okay, so when we look at our yield grades, so this is the USDA yield grading. It's actually from the Australian Intercollegiate Meat Judging Association. They have a whole USDA grading training program, which I thought was pretty interesting. But I think it shows kind of our yield grades pretty nicely. So this is a yield grade 1, so it means we get a lot of usable product here, okay? But if we look at this lamb, okay, so we see it has that low back fat thickness. We don't have a lot of that intramuscular marbling that we might see on this yield grade 3 right here. Okay, so remember, we need that marbling, but we also don't want a lot of back fat because that'll be that waste product. So essentially, the more back fat these animals get on them, the higher that yield grade, and so that means that less usable product. Okay, so we do take into account that yield grade. And so when we look at what the national dressing percentage of our lambs is, so how much product are we getting from our lambs, it is 54%, okay? And that's for a shorn lamb. So our pelt, that does decrease our dressing percentage. So if you have a wool breed, okay, if you don't shear it, you're going to have a lower dressing percentage, meaning you have lower product. Okay, and so if you process a 100-pound lamb, okay, it means you're getting about 54 pounds from your carcass. Okay, so if you are selling lambs on a live weight basis, you could probably expect your animals to get about 54% of their carcass weight in meat. But hair breeds, okay, so kind of like Shay mentioned, we have a lot of hair breeds here. Hair breeds differ in carcass composition. So Dr. Page brought this up and Shay brought it up, is that these animals are different than our wool breeds, okay? One way that our hair breeds are going to be different is they deposit more kidney and pelvic fat than our wool breeds. So it means they put more fat on their internal organs quicker than our other breeds. So that can affect essentially how much usable product we're getting from them. So when we look at carcass quality of our common sheep breeds in Hawaii, so we have those Dorper, the Katahdin, and the Barbados are the primary ones. And I believe Shay mentioned we had a few St. Croix. So if we look at just our Dorper sired lambs, okay, so our hair breed compared to one of our wool breeds, what that means, what we're seeing is we're seeing those Dorpers have a slightly higher dressing percentage, okay? So they are dressing a heavier carcass than those wool breeds. We do see a slightly higher quality grade. So essentially what these researchers did is they applied a numeric score to their marbling, okay? Because we saw that our Dorper sired had a slightly higher quality score, but they did have a worse yield grade. And that part of that might be of that kidney pelvic fat. Okay, so we might see more kidney pelvic fat in some of these Dorper sired animals. Okay. Yeah, and so that same group, they took more of those hair breeds. So again, this was about 20 years ago now, and they just kind of wanted to do a quick performance trial looking at this, and they found that those Katahdins, okay, so we have a lot of Katahdin, we have a lot of Dorper here, okay, they were outperforming hot carcass weight compared to our black belly and the St. Croix. They also had a lot of bigger loin muscle area, okay, so that loin muscle area is essentially we can use it to total muscle, so that bigger muscular area, which makes sense. They had a lot bigger carcass, they'll have a bigger muscle. And their quality grade was fairly high. So they did assign numeric scores and they had a really high quality grade. Okay. Our black belly, people who raise those Barbados black belly, they probably know they are a slightly smaller animal. But we do see that here, they laid down less fat, so they did have a lower quality grade. So if we wanted to up some of our quality grades, it might be beneficial to introduce some of the Katahdin into the black belly if we do have that. So we do see breed specific, and so these are just the breeds that we find here, but like I said, this research wasn't done here. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about was cobalt. So Shay found there was about 40% of the animals she sampled were deficient in cobalt. So this is a study that was done in Ireland looking at cobalt supplementation of sheep. And why they're looking at it is cobalt is necessary for that vitamin B12 synthesis. Okay. So we have to have cobalt to get vitamin B12 in our ruminants. And what they found is when they supplemented cobalt, it increased the body weight, the carcass weight, and the dressing proportion. Okay. So it improved essentially how much product they were getting. So this is something that might be interesting to apply here because we are seeing a slight cobalt deficiency. And they did see it was pretty beneficial to up cobalt to improve essentially carcass weight of those animals. So really just briefly, it's important to know your dressing percentage because that can impact essentially your, when you're selling those animals on a live weight, your buyers are probably going to want to know how much meat they're actually going to get. If you don't know that for your animals, you could probably guesstimate about 54% based off the national average. But you need to take into account the breeds you raise will impact that. And then the nutritional status of your animal can also impact that. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. And I'm more than happy to discuss it, or we can talk about it here. So yeah, thank you.